Imagine this. You wake up one morning and realize that every belief you've held about knowledge, success, and education was never truly yours. It was planted carefully, quietly, like seeds in the soil of your mind, growing into a garden that someone else designed. The textbooks, the classrooms, the exams, all arranged not to liberate you, but to shape you into something predictable, manageable, and obedient. This is not a dystopian fantasy. This is our world. And it was one that Plato foresaw over 2,000 years ago. In the Republic, Plato described a haunting image. Prisoners chained in a dark cave, facing a wall. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners move shadow casters, figures carrying objects that project flickering silhouettes on the stone wall. The prisoners, never having seen the real world, mistake these shadows for reality itself. They name them, debate them, build meaning around them, and yet they are only echoes of truth. Now imagine that one prisoner is freed. He turns, slowly, painfully, toward the light. It blinds him at first. It burns. But when his eyes adjust, he sees the fire, the shadow makers, and finally, the exit. He steps into the blinding sun, trembling, and for the first time beholds the real world. Color, form, life, essence, truth. Then he returns to the cave, desperate to free the others. But they laugh at him, mock him, call him mad. For to them, the shadows are everything. This is Plato's allegory of the cave, a story about truth, illusion, and the agonizing cost of awakening. Yet here's the darker realization. Plato wasn't describing an ancient myth about ignorance. He was warning us about education itself. Our systems of learning were meant to guide us out of the cave. Instead, they've rebuilt it, with smarter shadows, brighter screens, and more convincing illusions. We no longer see puppets behind the fire. We see glowing rectangles, polished degrees, and standardized success. We've mistaken the shadow of understanding for the substance of wisdom. The classroom, Plato might argue, has become a cave of its own, a place where knowledge is not discovered but delivered, where curiosity is tamed by structure, where truth is reduced to measurable outcomes. The tragedy lies not in the lack of information, but in the loss of wonder. Children begin their lives asking endless questions. Why is the sky blue? What makes the stars shine? But the system quickly conditions them to stop asking and start answering, to trade questions for grades, imagination for obedience. The fire flickers, the shadows dance, and the illusion of education deepens. Plato's darkest insight was that the majority of people don't want to leave the cave. Freedom, he said, is unbearable for those who have known only comfort. Real learning is painful, it dissolves certainties, it destroys old identities. And that is why societies, even today, prefer illusion over truth. The philosopher, then, is the one who dares to turn around, to confront the fire, to climb toward the blinding sun. But this climb is not rewarded. It is punished. The system resents those who question it. It fears the free thinker, the mind that refuses conformity. Education should be liberation, yet it too often becomes domestication. What Plato called the turning of the soul toward truth has become the bending of the will toward compliance. As he once wrote, "The object of education is to teach us to love what is beautiful." But somewhere along the centuries, beauty was replaced by utility, truth by efficiency, and wisdom by performance. We are still in the cave, only now the chains are invisible. And the question that hangs in the stale air of that cavern is this: do we truly want to be free, or do we only wish to believe that we are? When a society begins to fear chaos more than ignorance, it turns education into control. What was once meant to awaken the soul becomes a tool to shape it, softly, systematically, without resistance. Plato warned of this transformation long before any modern bureaucracy existed. He saw that the deepest danger to human freedom would not come from tyranny of the body, but tyranny of the mind. Think of the child, full of restless curiosity, wandering through the world with a heart wide open to mystery. Every sound, every shadow, every unanswered question becomes a doorway to wonder. But soon, The child enters a classroom where curiosity is redefined as distraction, and obedience is renamed discipline. The fire of inquiry begins to dim, replaced by a dull glow of conformity. This is not an accident. It is design. Education, in its institutional form, became the mechanism through which societies produce predictable citizens. Plato's vision of education in the Republic was, disturbingly, not democratic. It was hierarchical, selective, and moralistic. He imagined a system where each person was trained according to their nature. The gold, the silver, the bronze. It was efficient, perhaps even rational. But it was also cold, a vision of order where individuality is sacrificed for harmony. Modern systems have inherited this invisible hierarchy. We may no longer speak of golden souls and bronze workers, but we still stratify human potential through grades, tests, and credentials. We measure intelligence by speed, creativity by conformity, and worth by productivity. The machine hums quietly, turning human beings into economic functions. Here lies the paradox. Education promises liberation, yet it teaches dependence. It claims to teach us how to think, but in truth, it teaches what to think about. The curriculum decides which questions matter, which histories deserve memory, and which truths are acceptable. This is how societies manufacture minds. Philosophers like Ivan Illich and John Dewey tried to expose this hidden machinery, arguing that real learning must be rooted in experience, dialogue, and freedom. But their ideas, radical and humane, were absorbed and diluted by the very institutions they criticized. Schools began speaking the language of critical thinking while still enforcing rigid patterns of thought. Even rebellion, once a spark of youth, became a syllabus topic, a safe simulation of freedom. Plato might look at this and smile grimly. He would say, "You have perfected the shadows. For what are our diplomas but golden chains? What is a standardized test but a mirror reflecting the values of the system that built it?" The saddest part is how deeply this conditioning burrows into our sense of self. We begin to equate knowledge with validation, intelligence with approval. We study not to understand, but to be recognized. We fear being wrong more than being ignorant, and in that fear, our thinking becomes timid. It is not the absence of education that kills truth. It is the presence of education without soul. Plato understood this with painful clarity. He wrote, "The direction in which education starts a man will determine his future life. But what happens when that direction is twisted toward control rather than awakening? What kind of future, then, are we building? We have replaced the philosopher's ascent from darkness with a conveyor belt. Efficient, polished, mechanical. We are taught to compete, not to contemplate, to memorize, not to marvel. The system does not ask us to find meaning, only to maintain motion. And so, the cave of modern education gleams with fluorescent lights. The shadows are projected not by flickering fire, but by data, rankings, and algorithms. The illusion is complete, and the prisoners no longer resist, because the cave now feels like home. But somewhere deep within the human soul, the ancient ache for truth still stirs. The yearning to turn toward the light, the longing to remember what it means to know, cannot be silenced forever. And it is here, in this tension between obedience and awakening, that the next chapter of Plato's warning begins. There is a moment in every civilization when knowledge stops being a path to truth and becomes a weapon of control. It's a quiet transition, so subtle, so well justified, that almost no one notices when it happens. Knowledge begins to serve ambition. Truth is no longer something we seek, but something we manipulate. And when that day arrives, wisdom, the very soul of education, dies in silence. Plato feared this moment above all others. He believed that knowledge, ungoverned by virtue, would corrupt both the knower and the world. The philosopher king, he imagined, was the one who united intellect and morality, understanding and humility. But what happens when knowledge is divorced from goodness? When learning becomes a ladder for status, and intelligence becomes the language of domination? Look around. In our world, education has become the new currency of power. The degrees we chase are less about truth than about prestige. Universities market enlightenment the way corporations market luxury. Learning is branded, packaged, and priced. It no longer transforms. It performs. A young student enters a university not as a seeker of wisdom, but as a consumer of credentials. The library, once a sacred space of reflection, now hums with anxiety, competition, and fear of failure. Knowledge, once the fire that illuminated the cave, has become another shadow projected on its walls. Plato would call this the betrayal of wisdom, the moment when the love of truth is replaced by the lust for validation. He might see in our world an education system that worships intellect but forgets integrity, that glorifies achievement but neglects purpose. What makes this betrayal so dangerous is that it hides behind the illusion of progress. Technology, research, innovation, all noble pursuits, but pursued without moral compass, they lead us deeper into confusion. We have learned to split the atom, map the genome, and train machines to think, but we have forgotten how to ask why. The human mind can now access infinite information, yet it struggles to find meaning. We scroll through oceans of data, drowning in facts, starving for truth. The philosopher's lamp that once guided civilization now flickers weakly behind the neon glow of productivity. The betrayal of wisdom begins when we stop questioning the purpose of our knowledge. Why do we study? Why do we learn? To become more human or merely more efficient? In the absence of higher purpose, intellect turns inward, devouring itself. We produce clever arguments without understanding, theories without empathy, discoveries without conscience. Education becomes a ritual of accumulation, not illumination. Plato once wrote, "Knowledge which is acquired under compulsion obtains no hold on the mind." This truth echoes more urgently today than ever. We compel learning through fear of failure, of poverty, of irrelevance. But knowledge gained in fear cannot liberate. It can only enslave. The mind trained in fear learns to imitate, not to imagine. It obeys the rules of reason but forgets the rhythm of wisdom. It seeks certainty, even at the cost of truth. And in that pursuit, we have created a generation that is intelligent yet lost, informed yet directionless, connected yet isolated. The betrayal is not merely institutional, it is personal. Every time we choose recognition over understanding, every time we silence wonder for the sake of approval, we participate in the decay. The cave persists not because it is enforced, but because we have learned to decorate its walls. And so, we celebrate our ignorance as achievement. We build monuments to intellect while our spirits quietly starve. We applaud innovation while our souls remain untouched. The question Plato left for us is not whether education can make us smarter, but whether it can make us good. Without that moral anchor, knowledge becomes a mirror reflecting only our vanity. It gives us power without purpose, insight without empathy. And once wisdom is betrayed, the descent into illusion is almost impossible to reverse. But perhaps not entirely, for even in the heart of this betrayal, there remains a faint glimmer, a whisper that truth, though forgotten, still waits for those who are willing to seek it beyond the walls of the cave. The moment of awakening does not begin with light, it begins with discomfort. A faint unease creeps into the mind, a restlessness that refuses to be silenced. Something in the pattern of life feels false, rehearsed. The words of teachers, the routines of work, the expectations of society, all suddenly seem like echoes of a distant, hollow chorus. It is here, in this subtle rupture, that rebellion begins, not with anger, but with awareness. Plato's freed prisoner did not escape the cave in triumph. He stumbled, blinded, confused. His journey was not a declaration of victory, but an act of disobedience against illusion. The light hurt his eyes because truth, when first encountered, burns. It strips away everything comfortable and familiar. To awaken is to betray the system that raised you. It is to question the foundations of the knowledge you were taught to trust. It is to walk away from applause and toward uncertainty. Plato understood that the philosopher's path is lonely precisely because it cannot be shared with those who still love their shadows. Modern education discourages this rebellion of the mind. It rewards compliance disguised as excellence. Students who conform to expectation are praised as gifted, while those who question too deeply are branded as difficult. Yet, it is the difficult mind that moves civilization forward. Every advance in thought, every moral revolution, has begun as heresy within the temples of learning. To rebel intellectually is not to destroy, it is to remember. To remember that knowledge is not owned by institutions but lived by individuals. That truth cannot be standardized, only sought. The first step in escaping the cave is recognizing it. To see how deeply the patterns of control have woven themselves into the way we think, speak, and learn. The language of education is filled with invisible traps: achievement, success, failure. Each word carries moral weight, training us to fear deviation and worship conformity. But real learning begins when these words lose their power, when we stop asking, "Am I succeeding?" and start asking, "Am I awakening?" This is not the rebellion of destruction, it is the rebellion of vision. To reclaim your mind, you must reclaim your questions. The mind that dares to ask why, in a world that demands how, is already free. The mind that hungers for meaning rather than metrics has already begun its climb toward the light. Yet the climb is not gentle. Freedom, as Plato saw it, requires pain. The freed soul must confront the terrifying emptiness left behind when the illusions fall away. Without the structure of the cave, one must construct meaning from within. This is why so many return to the shadows. They prefer certainty over clarity. But the philosopher persists. He endures the blinding brilliance until his eyes adjust to truth. And once he sees, he cannot unsee. His duty, though tragic, is to return, to descend again into the cave and try to awaken others, knowing they may hate him for it. That is the tragedy of wisdom. It isolates. The awakened mind becomes an exile in its own society, condemned not for ignorance, but for insight. History has proven this over and over. Socrates drank the poison for questioning his city. Galileo was silenced for questioning the heavens. The light has always demanded a price. As Friedrich Nietzsche later wrote, one must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. That chaos, the storm of thought, the revolt of curiosity, is the birthplace of freedom. The rebellion of the mind is not a revolution fought in streets, but in the silent corridors of consciousness. It begins every time you refuse to accept what you are told simply because it is written in a textbook or endorsed by authority. It grows every time you choose to understand rather than to memorize, to feel rather than to perform. And when enough minds awaken, when enough souls turn toward the blinding sun of truth, the cave begins to crumble, not through violence, but through illumination. For the greatest rebellion is not to destroy the world's illusions, but to outgrow them. Imagine the freed prisoner returning to the cave, trembling but illuminated, carrying the truth he has seen like a fragile flame cupped in his hands. He descends once more into the shadows, his eyes struggling to adjust to the dimness. The others look at him with suspicion. His words, full of the brilliance of sunlight, sound like madness in the darkness. They mock him, then fear him, then reject him entirely. And yet, he returns not to boast, but to remind them that there is more beyond what they can see. This is where the allegory meets us, not as metaphor, but as moral demand. What does it mean to return to the cave once you've glimpsed the truth? What does it mean to teach in a world that has forgotten how to seek? To reclaim the meaning of education, we must first resurrect its soul. Plato did not see education as a process of instruction, but as a turning of the entire being, a transformation of the soul toward what is real, good, and beautiful. Education was not about knowing more, but about becoming more. Somewhere along the centuries, this idea was buried under the weight of systems, metrics, and profit. Learning became transactional. Schools became factories. Teachers became managers of outcomes rather than guides of awakening. And students, those radiant minds, became products of a process instead of participants in a journey. But truth, like light, cannot be permanently buried. Even in the most mechanized systems, the human soul hungers for meaning. We see this in those moments when a teacher breaks from the script to speak honestly, when a student questions something not for the sake of a grade, but because it stirs something in their being. These are the cracks where the light still gets in. To reclaim education, we must first dare to love again. Love truth, love wisdom, love the act of discovery itself. Knowledge without love is sterile. It produces cleverness but not understanding. Plato believed that eros, the passionate love for what is true and beautiful, was the force that lifted the soul toward enlightenment. Without that love, knowledge becomes cold machinery. We must also restore humility. In an age obsessed with certainty, humility becomes the doorway to learning. To admit we do not know is not weakness. It is the beginning of wonder. True education does not fill us. It empties us of arrogance, opening space for awe. But perhaps most importantly, we must reimagine education as a shared act of liberation. Cannot remain confined to institutions. It must return to the public square, the dinner table, the quiet space between two people seeking meaning together. The philosopher's task is no longer reserved for the academic. It belongs to everyone who refuses to live among shadows. Plato's cave still exists, but so does the sun. The problem has never been the existence of ignorance, but the absence of courage, the courage to turn, to climb, to endure the pain of awakening. That courage must once again become the heart of learning. In a society that worships information, wisdom has become an act of rebellion. To seek truth for its own sake, to learn without agenda, to value beauty over utility, these are radical choices. Yet, they are the only ones that can restore our humanity. Education must no longer serve the market. It must serve the soul. It must no longer prepare us merely to make a living, but to live well. It must remind us, as Plato tried to, that knowledge divorced from virtue leads not to progress, but to ruin. And so, the task of our time is not to reform education, but to redeem it, to return it to its original purpose, the awakening of the human spirit. Plato gave us the map long ago. He showed us that truth is not taught, but remembered, that the soul already knows, but has forgotten. Education, at its truest, is simply the art of remembering who we are. As Socrates said, education is the kindling of a flame, not the filling of a vessel. And perhaps that is how we finally escape the cave. Not by breaking its walls, but by lighting enough flames to make the darkness irrelevant.